Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of CME in Conversation, where I am delighted to be joined by Nate Holder. Nate, if you can just introduce yourself a little bit for our audience, please.
Hi everyone. Like I said, Nate Holder. I like to think of what I do as analyzing and thinking about many different ways in which we can make music education, the music industry a little bit better for folks of all different backgrounds. And fundamentally, I'm a musician as well, so that is, my passion is music and performing, playing, the occasional writing, and yeah, been lucky to travel around the world and play, which has been really cool as well, which is, I think, feeds into the work I do in music education, just helps to give a bit more perspective on people and context as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And we will get on to talking about kind of your wider work, I'm sure, by the end of this conversation. But one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you today was because in the CME, as we've obviously had a chat about, there are various different assessment criteria that encourage our learners to explore different musical genres and traditions and styles with their pupils. And sometimes I think for some of our learners, they might come from quite a kind of, I don't know if monocultural is the right way to describe kind of musical background. You know, they've come up through a classical tradition or sometimes a pop tradition or a jazz tradition. And because that's been their focus, they haven't really stepped outside. So when they're then being asked, oh, how can you bring all these other types of music into your practice? For some people, that's a little bit alarming and they don't really know where to begin. So I thought you would be a really great person to chat to about that. And the first thing I wanted to ask you really to kick us off was why you think it's important that music educators do actually use a variety of those different genres, cultures, and traditions of music in their teaching.
Um, I think there's lots of ways I feel like I can answer that question. I feel like fundamentally though, it's still asking that question, well, what's education for, right? Like what's music education for? And I think if we go at it from that perspective of thinking, well, if music education is, not just these things, but if it's about exposure, if it's about creativity, if it's about confidence building, if it's about, understanding context and, so many other different things, skills, just learning different skills, new skills, then I think it becomes imperative that we, like I said, expose, young people to many different styles of music so that they can, so that they can like explore for themselves, they can explore in class, because obviously at a certain point, education stops, right? And people are on their own. And I think and it's a question, if education is for the purposes of helping folks to navigate through the world, then the onus is on educators to provide young people and students with the skills to be able to do that, as opposed to it being, well, you have to listen to this, you have to listen to this, you have to do that, you have to do that. It's about kind of stepping back and kind of, I guess, in some ways being a bit meta with it all and just saying, well, if I'm trying to prepare you for the world, then to prepare you for the world, you should kind of know a little bit about the music that comes from different places and made by different people in different contexts, etc.
Fantastic, thank you. I guess, like you said, it's quite big picture, isn't it? That it's kind of the overall aim, kind of philosophy around sharing those different kind of cultural experiences with children. Um, when we're talking about music specifically, what do you kind of think are the specific benefits for, say, developing skills in terms of like as a performer or as a composer or even your critical listening skills through listening to and engaging with lots of different types of music?
I think in giving young people, a really diverse range of music to listen to, um, again, I think it comes down to, in any given piece of music, right, or any given song or any given instrumental or whatever it is, you can always approach it from many different angles, right? So I think in planning, in putting together, whether it's like repertoire for the year, or listening list or whatever it is, it could be an option. I'm not saying that it should be, but it could be an option to think about what are the angles that we're going to approach this music from, whether it's thinking about the harmony, the melody, the social context, the historical context, where we're looking at it through, if we want to go there, feminist lens, or a lens, whatever it is, right? And then I think being explicit with those with the way in which we're kind of approaching different songs or even different styles. I think allows young people to come away with these ideas around what music can be, right? Because I remember, for example, getting to university and having gone through just years of like music and doing GCSE, A level, all that kind of stuff, and then getting to university and then they've been like, yeah, so there are a bunch of people who just didn't care about all those rules. I remember just being like, what? Like, so you mean to tell me all of that parallel stuff that I wasn't allowed to do, you're allowed to do it? And like, I shouldn't be surprised. I shouldn't, have, at 6, 7 years, 8 years, or whatever it was of like education in the system, and then kind of be surprised that like, oh, I didn't know that was allowed, and they're famous because they did. You know what I mean? And I think there could be so much more creativity. And but if we're allowed to explore, if we're allowed to listen to music, not just to analyze it, but to listen and enjoy it. Because I think sometimes that kind of gets missed out, right? It's like, we're listening to this piece of music, listen for this, listen for that, listen for this. Can you hear this? But the other side of it of like, how does it make you feel? Or did you like it, right? Like outside of the musical analysis, sometimes get lost. I think sometimes that's where young people can switch off, literally, right? Switch off and be like, I'm not interested, because this is not about enjoyment. Because for most, I think, I can say probably for all people, music is a source of enjoyment, source of pleasure, whether it's, catharsis, whether it's, to relax, whether it's to kind of help to focus your concentration, to get you amped for something, whatever. But then in the classroom, it's like, well, we're analyzing. And so it's like, well, no, I don't want to do that. I want to enjoy it. So other ways in which we can, in some ways do both, but also remembering that, like, yes, I think part of the reason why music is so powerful is because it connects and it speaks to our emotions, rather than, constantly being in that position of listening to understand. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I wonder, excuse me, and we are digressing a little bit from the kind of pre-planned questions. I wonder, because obviously you've got that performance background as well, as have I, but we work in very different genres. Do you feel that your knowledge of lots of different musical styles is beneficial to you as a performer, even when you're not performing in those styles?
It depends. You know what? It depends, because I think sometimes sometimes you're called to do a specific job. And so I'm not thinking about minimalism when, if I'm playing a Dua Lipa, right? Like, that's just not that's not what I'm there for in that moment. But maybe in other situations, if it's a band situation where we're playing some original music, sure, I can think about how could I translate, I don't know, like a rapper that I like, for example. How can I translate Little Sim's flow onto my saxophone in this moment, right? Or what are some of the textures that, I don't know, maybe Stravinsky kind of uses, and how can that actually be, how can that work in this kind of jazz fusion context, right? Because it could, how can these experimental ideas of, using my saxophone as a percussion, thinking about it as a percussive instrument, actually be quite interesting here. So yeah, I think it definitely helps, and think about scales and scale colors as well, not just, and modes, not just like thinking, oh, I'm going to use this scale here and this here and there, and this piece, this sounds like this, so I'm going to use it here. But, just being aware of how different people have used, a major scale, whether it's, thinking about triad pairs, or whether it's thinking about, substitutions or superimposition, or any of those different things. And yeah, just seeing how it can all fit into something in the moment. But of course, realizing and knowing time and place. Like, can't be doing that if you're playing someone down the aisle, right? That's probably not what you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You just reminded me of a brilliant story of a singer friend of mine who was asked to sing Ave Maria at a wedding, and she brought along her backing track of like all the stuff that she normally sang, sang Ave Maria, but then forgot to press stop, and it started playing the Bare Necessities, which was really not the vibe they were going for that
Oh,
wedding. Yeah, Yeah,
That's like both, that's horrific and hilarious at the same time.
it is, isn't it? It's like an anxiety dream come to life.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. No, I find it really interesting that, eh, eh, you're saying that the all the other stuff you know about is like useful to draw from in certain situations. And I would say, as coming from a sort of very, very strictly kind of classical background for a long time, I absolutely struggled for ages to be able to do anything that wasn't exactly what I'd been taught. I particularly struggled with oral tradition. And because I was taught to sight read, and even now, if you try and teach me a song by ear, I can do it, but I would much rather have the music to read, even if that's technically incorrect for the style. So I feel like I would have benefited earlier in my education from doing stuff, learning to play by ear, from learning to improvise, because I've had to really try and catch up with that in my teaching. And in the early part of my career, my pupils were not getting the best out of me because I did not have those skills that would have been useful to pass on to them. Um, I think for our CME learners, for some of them, when they approach, because the criteria say, in fact, I've got them written down somewhere, that says something along the lines of, use different genres and traditions in your teaching and explain how that can be beneficial. And for a lot of them who come from a very similar, I would say, musical background to me, it becomes, oh, well, when you have the first lesson, you pick a pop song that the kids like to get them into the idea of playing the piano, whatever it is. And then once they've got excited about playing the piano, then we play Bach and Handel and Mozart. And it becomes the kind of, oh, it's the hook to then make them do the stuff you want them to do. And I get very strongly, I think, from conversations with you and from the work that you do, that you're very much the kind of opposite end. It's not about coming from where the children are to make them do the thing you want them to do. It's about kind of going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I think there's I think I think we have to be flexible. Like I think we have to be flexible. I think definitely there's times where it's like, all right, this is what we're trying to do, so we need to do this. Um, but other times, I think it's great. Just take a step back and be like, all right, cool. This is what you lot enjoy, great. Like maybe I don't like it, maybe I don't know it. But there's lessons that that we can take from this, right? Um, yeah, I think it's yeah, the idea of kind of introducing, like I said, like a pop tune and then being like, all right, great. Now you're invested. Now we're going to give you the real stuff. Again, I think that kind of speaks to that earlier point about, well, what is education for? Is it about teaching you have to learn X, Y, and Z, um, or is it about, I'm going to try and teach you as many different things as possible, show you many different things as possible, give you the space to express yourself in as many different ways as possible, with the hopes that everything that you learn from here, you either take and run with it at home because you find it really fascinating, or later on in life, you're like, actually, like that was really interesting. Like, let me revisit this Vivaldi, or let me revisit this, whatever it is, and let's see what happens. You know what I mean? Yeah, do try and think of it like a long term. If music is a lifelong learning, you know, thing, um, then education can't just be for the moment. You know what I mean? It has to kind of, I think, like, yes, I think, and you might be different. You might think it's not important to learn that. I might think, yeah, it's important to learn that, which is, I think, what's great about being, teacher and educator, where you can be like, this is where I'm coming from, and I'm giving you what I'm coming from. I just think it's amazing. If everyone was doing the same thing in exactly the same way, I don't think that's great.
Mm.
Because also, as a teacher, as an educator, you there's an excitement around sharing the things that either you've just discovered, or you know very well, or you're curious about, right? As opposed to, I have to do this, and then that disconnects, not just with the students, where they might be like, I like this but I don't study this, but it's also, as an educator yourself, is like, I like this stuff but I'm not allowed to talk about this stuff, or I can't do this stuff because I have to do this. And so, you walk in like, oh, I've got to do this, and the kids walk in, oh, I've got to do this, and everyone's annoyed from the start. It's like, that's not fun at all. Um, yeah, so I think one of the great things about listening to lots of different music and really, learning about it is that you can, in I think in different ways, find connections with so many different styles and people, even if those connections aren't necessarily musical. But sometimes it's just little things that you never think about, and you realize that person knew that person lived there, that person did that, and it might not be, like I said, a musical connection, but it could be a connection for a kid in the class of like, oh, I used to live there, or I went there, or I've eaten this food, or oh yeah, I've heard about this person before, and that could be, that spark of connection could be the difference between me concentrating for 2 minutes versus 5, and those 3 minutes could be the difference between me being like, actually, this is really cool versus I'm just gonna mess around until it's time to go and play football outside.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've all been in those kind of lessons. Yeah. Um, I I wonder if you've got any advice for our CME learners and also other teachers out there who maybe are feeling overwhelmed about where to start, or maybe worried about kind of starting in the wrong way or doing or saying the wrong thing. What would be your advice to like how to um sort of start off on that journey of developing your own knowledge outside of your own little niche in
Yeah.
music? And
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, I struggle too. Like, it's so easy to be like, oh my gosh, like I'm gonna put something on. I know this. I'm gonna put this on. Um, what I've found really good actually is, even though it's very, you realize how specific these things are, and that's a whole other conversation about lists. But I think Apple just put out a top 100 albums of all time. Rolling Stone do that, I think, every year as well. And I found that to be a really interesting way of being like, all right, cool. I'm going to start from, I think I remember they did one with 500, I think, 500 greatest albums of all time. So it's like, all right, I'm going to start from the 500th one and kind of skip the albums that I've already heard, in passing or whatever. I'm just going to skip those. But I'm just going to start at 500. I don't know what it is. I've never heard of this band, whatever, and just listen to it. And I think that's an easy way because it means you don't really have to do much work. You just, you find the list and you just like play it. As opposed to thinking, all right, I want to learn more about this style. So like, do I listen to that person or is that? And I don't know, like, do I listen to that album or to listen to that? Just that, someone's played a playlist. Do I do that? So I think playlists can be amazing in that because it saves you the work of having to figure out, all right, this is gonna be from this country and this specific style, this specific person. Just use it as a gateway to like, all right, I'm gonna check out this list of the top 100 albums of all time potentially. But again, it's a very, 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 very narrow idea of the greatest albums of all time, and that's, again, like I said, it's a whole nother conversation. But I think playlists, I found playlists like that and lists like that really good for me to just say, all right, I don't know about this. I didn't grow up listening to the Who, for example. So I was like, all right, let me figure out but then I'm like, what album? Cool. All right, let me their first album, let me check it out, and just have a listen. Like, all right, actually, it's different to what I thought it was. Cool. All right, let me check out some Led Zeppelin. Didn't grow up with them, so let me have a listen. You know, and then I think there's a bit of, I think one thing about listening to music is that it takes time. Not that it takes time to listen to an album, but I think it takes time to really settle into your into a way that where you can talk about it, right? So you listen to an album once, and it's easy for you just not to remember anything.
Mhm.
um, but I think if you kind of, if you're able to kind of go back and listen to an album like maybe once, one particular album in 1 week, or one particular album over the course of 3 days, so let's say 2 albums a week, and there might be some that you really enjoy, there might be some that you really don't like, or a playlist doesn't have to be a whole album, um, but just favoriting stuff that just catches your ear, straight away, um, and then you can always go back to the favorites, and then I think the idea of community is really cool because you can find people who not are just like diehard, fans of the Who, for example, but there might be others who are like, I'm trying to figure out what should I listen to next, and there's an opportunity for you to connect. Say, this is what I'm listening to. Have you got a recommendation? And can just start to build from there. I think we should do more of that really as educators, of just listening and talking about music as opposed to
Mhm.
talking about how we should teach it.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there. Um, I am going to ask you how you should teach it though. Just completely ruin that with a terrible segue. No, what I what I was interested in, I suppose, is sometimes I think sometimes people are okay with, say, your classical, your Western kind of pop styles, all that kind of stuff, and they feel like they feel like almost they have ownership over that, so they can do what they like with it. When it comes to the music of other continents, other countries, I think sometimes one of two things happens. People do it really, really insensitively, and we've spoken in the past, and obviously you've written lots of blogs and things on the idea of kind of African music and African songs, and how that's kind of very reductive. And um I think people are getting better at sort of understanding that they need to be a bit more context specific for those purposes. But schools have finite resources, obviously, and particularly I'm thinking primary schools. The teachers themselves might not be very skilled. They've only got your glockenspiels and things. And some schools have said to me, we can't do those musical styles because, it would be offensive to play the music of a different country on the glockenspiel when that's what it was originally invented for. And I wonder how much I just wonder what your take on that is, and how worried we should be about those things, and where the flexibility is for educational purposes, where the balance is for that. And apologies, because this has just come straight off the top of my head, and you had no idea I was going to
My
ask you that,
thinking
and I,
face
I
is
didn't know either.
my thinking face is like, oh, okay. I think it's a really tricky. I think it's a really tricky question. Because I think this is all very context specific, context like based, right? Like
Mhm.
I think sometimes how some of the conversations are framed, right, around this, it definitely comes from a very. I come from a classical background. I don't know how to approach this style of music. Whereas there are many folks who know how to approach that style of music. And so those conversations with them are like, well, I don't know how I can interact in this conversation because you're coming from this point of, I want to explore, let's say music from, you know, from India, let's say, for example. But I don't know how to do it and I'm scared. And I could be there being like, well, like this is you're scared of the music of the country that I come from. That feels very weird to me, right?
Mm.
Like it feels very strange. So I think sometimes conversations don't speak to all music educators, because there are some who are very, maybe because they've come from certain traditions, or maybe because they've studied it, who don't feel worried about it. Um, I think one of the things that we have a issue with, I think, at the moment is there are many different voices saying many different things, and some of those voices I don't think really represent the people whose music, or whose country of origin or whatever it comes from. I think over the last few years, there's been a lot of scaremongering, and that's not to say that it's not good to be critical, and it's not good to even to be scared in some way, or to be afraid of doing the wrong thing. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, again, coming back to education, what is education for? Is it to be perfect? I don't think so. Is it to represent things in a as authentic as possible? I think sure. If you don't have an instrument that is, that was handmade by this person, and this, and I don't think I personally don't think that's an issue. I think what the issue does come down to is, as an individual, if you're doing your due diligence to be clear about what you're teaching. Because let me give an example in language, right? I learned German as an adult, and one of the things I was unfortunately I didn't learn as a child, but I remember, you pick up things just as a kid, right? You just pick up bits and pieces, and one of the things I remembered clearly was a couple of words, like so, you know, I remember Auf Wiedersehen very, very clearly, right? And there was a couple of other phrases that I remember from just, I think just even just walking past Germany, you just see them all the time, right? And I think living in Germany for a while made me realize actually people don't talk like that, right? Studying French, I remember there were lots of different things that we learned, and my French is horrible now, but I remember speaking to some people and saying people don't talk like that. And so what was happening was we were being taught something, but it wasn't the reality. And so I'm sure it's happened to so many people. They're like, yeah, I can speak French. And then you go to a restaurant in France or you go to wherever and you try and talk, and they'll look at you like you sound like you're from the 30s, right? Like from the 1930s or something. Like why are you using this very formal way of saying hi to me? You know what I mean? Like, and I think same with music. One of the fears that I think maybe I have and other people have is that you say, all right, kids, and it's a, yeah, for example, let's talk about African drumming, right? This idea that now you can do this. And the fear is, my fear, and I think others' fear is that, a child meets someone from, whether they go to Nigeria, whether they go to Iraq, whether they go to Morocco, whether they go to South Africa, Madagascar, wherever, and they say, I do this, without realizing that, just like in that French or German lesson, you haven't been taught actually what this music is. You've been taught this, in some ways, this whitewashed version and this sanitized version of something that approximates this, right? And so I think it's a long-winded way to say, I think it's our responsibility to, if we're not teaching in the right, if we're not teaching something specific, to say, hey guys, if we're going to speak, I'm teaching you French, don't go and use this in France because it's not going to work. But I'm teaching you this, and so it's up to you. You know what I mean? I'm just being very honest with you. If you go and say this to a French person, they'd probably look at you weird, or they'd understand you, but be like, that's just not what's going on right now. And I think that also speaks to the idea of how music evolves and changes, where, uh, influences from, I wrote a blog, and I think I did some sessions around, like, Africa and music for Africa. And, there's this idea of that, it's very, again, Africa is a massive place, right? Huge place. And we forget how big it is. Forget how many different peoples and styles of music come from Africa. And the truth is, we rarely, I'm talking about when I was in school, and I think even just images I see, I rarely see this image of African people, whether they're north, south, east, west, playing a keyboard, right? Or it's this antiquated idea of, which is, I think, in some ways delivered implicitly, of drums equals Africa, Africa equals drums. Anything else is like, that's not African, you know what I mean? And so the fear is kids go through life being like, well, that's African music is drums. That's what it is. As opposed to so many, like, guitars and keyboards and singing and jazz, and like, that's not associated with it. And so I think if you're going to do that, be very clear, like, this is not what's happening on the continent right now, or at least if it is happening, it's happening in very specific contexts where it might be to do with tourism, for example. It might be, but this idea of, and I've seen it so many times, online especially, or, descriptions of, this is, this unit is about the music of Africa. Drums are played, celebrations for like births and deaths, and it's like, what? Like, you speak to the average, a friend of mine, it's like, bro, like, no one's playing the drums in the hospital when a child is born. Like, that's, but that's the fact is, if you combine that with kind of pop culture references of Africa, you think of children learning about Africa from the Lion King, for example. Not to say that's a bad thing, but it's like, as a child, you're picking up on little different things that you hear about, and you're putting it together to form a picture in your mind. And so it's very easy then to be like, as an 8-year-old, as a 9-year-old, if you haven't had that exposure, to be like, what is Africa? Africa is animals, right? It's the Lion King. Africa is drums, and the other negative things like poverty, blah blah blah. That's the mind that you have, and then you start to encounter folks, and you start to see other things, and that can change. But I think it's very important to remember that as educators and as young people, identity formation or formation of people around you, it starts from 1-2 years old. And so the images and the ideas of what you're telling young people about a particular style of music can have a massive impact in the
Mm.
future, whether it's not necessarily being overtly racist, but having misconceptions and ideas around, I'm just going to go to India and be like, I know how to do your music now because I studied it for 2 years. You know what I mean? Where's this instrument or where's that instrument? It's like, no, we're doing a cover of, I don't know, the Beatles. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's not, but again,
Yeah.
that's the idea. If you're in India, this is the music you play. If you're in, China, this is the music you play. If you're in Japan, this is the music you play. It's like there's so many different things. And so I think we have to be very, very clear and open about what we're teaching and the context and how it's been in some ways taken way out of context, but being
Mm.
very clear, and we can say the same thing in history and English of, yes, I'm teaching you about World War II, but you have to understand this is coming from this perspective, this one perspective of how World War II unfolded. And you speak to someone else from a different part of the world, and they might say, actually, the reason why, Britain and the Allies won was because of India, right? But if you don't get that in school, I think I think we have to be very specific about this is the perspectives that we're coming from. This is actually what we're teaching you. If you try and take that outside, you're going to be laughed at, probably, or people are going to look at you strange. But I think it's important that we're honest about what we're teaching. You know what I mean? We're honest about where we're getting our sources from. And I think in being honest about where it comes from, that's not to say that we don't try and expand our own horizons and perspectives. And obviously, age appropriateness, and we don't need to be specific when we're talking about like 6-year-olds trying to teach them to like about basis of rhythm, right? But I think the idea of being truthful and being authentic and being as honest as we can be about what we're teaching is so important. And I think once we can be honest about actually this is not the reality, we can be honest with ourselves and say, all right, if we are trying to make it as real as possible, what can we do? Yes, we might not have the exact drums, but I don't, again, speaking to depending on who you speak to, I don't think, and from myself speaking to certain folks, if you don't have that, there's lots of folks around the world who are very happy to see kids interacting with the music, period.
Mm-hmm.
Like, very happy to see that. Whether they're doing it on buckets, whether they're doing it on pianos, you're interacting with the music of our country, and that's great. And then of course, there's other layers and other folks who can come in and say how to do things. But again, but that's not to say, all right, well, if someone is happy with you, playing, I don't know, music from South America on your recorder instead of on a panpipe, then yeah, do what you want to do. But I think it's, again, being very honest. How can we be more honest about what we're doing and the perspectives that we're coming from, instead of making it sound like, when I teach you this, this is the universe, this is the truth, this is what it is. When I teach you that, that is what it is.
Yeah, I
So
totally agree. It's about contextualization, isn't it? It's about being honest about what you do and don't know, and making sure that the children understand that if you're doing one unit that is about West African drumming, that doesn't mean they understand the music from the entirety, or even probably doesn't mean they understand West African drumming either.
yeah, yeah,
So I think, and I think maybe teachers aren't really aware of that kind of. I think when we think of the music of other countries, we immediately think of like folk music, don't we, and traditional music. But if you asked about the music of England, most people wouldn't say, oh, yes, here's a lovely Morris dancing piece. They would talk to you about Ed Sheeran or Adele, or, maybe Edward Elgar. So I think there's maybe a shift in perspective to be had there somewhere, about when we talk about music from other places, we don't just talk about their original kind of traditional music, because that's not what we do when we talk about our music. When we talk about English music, we aren't, generally speaking, talking about folk music. We tend to be talking about our artists and our composers.
yeah.
um
I think
and I
that's
like.
a very specific way of of looking at the world. Which I guess it's probably another topic for another time. But I think one thing I just want to, I do want to just emphasize that, like, I don't think all of this is on individual teachers either. Like,
mm,
you can only work with what you're given in many cases, and you can explore and stuff. But I think there's a lot to be said around the materials that you're given, the materials you have access to, and how curricula are structured that in many different ways when we're saying, yes, be different, it's like, but I can't. And it's not your fault. It's this, there's a systemic issue with, I think, how we approach and how we teach and how we resource certain musics that is fundamentally not your fault. And I think sometimes in all these conversations, it's I'm very conscious of kind of making that point, because for many, I think many teachers could feel like, oh my gosh, I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to do this. And it's like, yeah, sure, there's an element you have to, but also I think there's an element of us coming together and saying, hey, if we are to do this, we need help to do this. We need to, whether it's widen the parameters, give us more time, give us different resources, give us the tools to be able to do the thing that we know we want to do, as opposed to make do with what you have, but do it totally differently. That's not fair. You know what I mean? So it's not just on individuals, it's also on the systems and the people who are in control of the systems. And yeah, there is stop there.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think we're lucky in this country that our national curriculum does actually encourage you to look at a wide range of different genres and traditions. And I think sometimes people feel like if they're going for GCSE or A level, they have to narrow their curriculum as a result. But if you speak to, particularly around GCSE, if you speak to the exam boards, they will debunk those myths very quickly, and they'll say, no, you don't have to read music, and you don't have to be having instrumental lessons, and you don't have to know a lot about classical music, because there are other forms of music in the qualification. And I think sometimes, yeah, we get kind of bogged down in what we think the system wants us to do, and actually some of that stuff is stuff that we've just kind of invented for ourselves sometimes, and some of it is a legitimate barrier. I mean, I remember obviously a long time ago now, when I was applying for university back in the 20th century, we a lot of places wouldn't take you unless you'd done an A level that had harmony in it and all this kind of stuff, and I'd done an A level that had composition in it, and that was seen as a kind of a lesser thing somehow. I think the tide has definitely changed on that, and my experience, fairly recently of working at Leeds Conservatoire has been that when we're looking for people to come on and kind of study with us and go on to professional careers, we're looking for that flexibility, we're looking for that engagement with different styles and the ability to do lots of different things. I remember having a conversation with someone from Birmingham Conservatoire, who's not there anymore, but was in charge of their kind of audition process. We had this really interesting chat, and he said one of the things he liked to do was just stop the entire audition process and ask people to play Happy Birthday on their instrument, and the number of people who couldn't play Happy Birthday on their own instruments because all they'd done was like go down that graded pathway learning what their teacher had told them to learn. And he said that was a really good indicator for them whether that person was going to have the kind of flexibility and creativity to actually survive as a musician. And I guess obviously not all music education is going to end up in a career, but for people like yourself who obviously ended up with a performing career, I guess the more input you can have from lots of different kind of musical traditions, genres, styles, different ways of working, the better, really, to help you, I guess, be more employable and be more flexible and just generally a more creative artist.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, and I think for many other folks, I'm very lucky to have like music lessons weren't the only music that I got, right? So, being brought up in church, and especially that tradition, just gives a whole new perspective on what it is to learn music and to listen to music and to be around musicians and to learn from musicians. Is totally different. And so there's so many folks who don't go, who will go through that, maybe, the jazz route through, programs in local communities, whatever. And then who kind of, if here is being a professional musician and this is the education path, kind of do that and get there anyway without going through that. And I think that's part of the reason why, the decline of or some of the decline of music education I think could be chalked up to that total disconnect between those folks who can do it and are learning music from outside and just bringing that into whatever space they're in. And people realizing, actually, I don't need to study this to be able to do it, because what I'm being taught isn't, again, what's the purpose of education? I'm not being taught to be able to do that. So what's the point? Let me spend my time, get my A level in biology or in maths or in business, and those are employable skills. But reading counterpoint, I don't know how many people are getting a job for unfortunately, from what I mean, from doing that, as opposed to the other styles that we might talk about, maybe production or whatever. But again, I think that speaks to well, something that you said earlier around it's a certain kind of person. It's people who can understand certain elements of Western classical music, for example, who can then become teachers. Because if you don't, it's even if you've got so much knowledge, it's very difficult to be able to then be like, yes, you've widened the parameters that I can teach now. It's like, well, I still can't because I don't have the qualifications to show that I can do it. So even though I could, I still can't. And so I think what sometimes left with is folks who come from a position who understand how to do the dots and all of that stuff, then being asked, be different. It's like, well, I've spent 20 years, 30 years of my life not doing this. And I know there are folks who can do it, but they can't get in. So, and then I'm not being given the resources enough to be able to do this. So I'm stuck, so I guess, yeah. There are lots of systemic issues, I think, in simply just saying, let's be more diverse in our listening or in our musical analysis.
Yeah, I totally agree. I guess the kind of sense I'm getting from you is that we should, as teachers, be doing our best to not let our pupils end up in the position that we might have found ourselves in, where we haven't had those experiences, and now we're kind of playing catch up, which, as I said at the start, is very much how I felt over my kind of my teaching career, really. And it is doable, but when you're planning lessons and supervising lunches and doing all this kind of stuff, finding the time to actually be able to educate yourself about different styles of music is tricky. Something I say to primary teachers quite a lot, because primary teachers, especially non-specialists, tend to be obviously frightened about every aspect of music. So it doesn't really matter whether you're asking them to do a music of a totally different culture or music of their own culture. It's all equally scary. And sometimes I say to them, you just need to be honest with the pupils that this isn't something that you did yourself at school, and you're learning alongside each other. And if mistakes are made, as long as when you recognize there's a mistake, you correct it and talk about it, that's okay. It's fine to make mistakes, and it's fine to be taking little baby steps, as long as you start somewhere, rather than just going, I'm not going to do any of that because that's too scary and too hard and too difficult. And
I do think
most
it
teachers,
does depend what those mistakes are. I would say that.
yeah, well, yeah,
It
yeah,
does depend. Yeah.
it does. But then it's a life skill, isn't it, to make a mistake and be able to own up to it, and actually quite powerful, I would say, for the children to see you make an error and go, oops, that was wrong, I shouldn't have done that. I'm very sorry, let's try it a different way. It's there are so many people, I think, who are incapable of apologizing for anything in this day and age. That's quite, there's quite a good thing to model in our schools, I think, the ability to just own your mistakes and say sorry and kind of try and correct it and move on.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. That was really fascinating. It was great to chat to you, as always. I know that you have created some resources yourself, haven't you? Like your books and things for use in schools. So is there anything that you can tell us that you think would be useful for our learners or for other teachers to help them to explore music of different cultures and that kind of thing?
Yes, I think. um, I think over the last few years, I've put a whole bunch of stuff on my blog. You feel free to check it out. There's also a page, and there's probably a blog post coming soon where put together a bunch of resources to just, not of my own, but just kind of scouring the internet and just being like, look, check it out. So there's a couple of those posts up as well. So yeah, and yeah, look out because I'll definitely have to do another one, because yeah, it can be difficult sometimes, I think, to be scouring into trying to find different things. So I'll try and put stuff into one place, so that it's a bit more easily accessible. But yeah, I have some books that again on my website, and if you're interested, please feel free to check them out. But, yeah, I think one thing is important, like I said before, talk to other teachers, and don't feel like you have to do it all on your own, because there are folks who are doing amazing things already, who are sharing their resources that they've created for free or maybe at a small fee. Just connect with other teachers, and yeah, just don't feel alone in doing what you're doing. I think that's really important.
Fantastic. What a great note to finish on. So thank you very much. If all this chat has piqued your interest about the CME, you can find underneath the video in the description some information about how the CME works and how to get involved with it. You can also obviously hit subscribe if you want to be able to see all of these videos. So this is our 5th one, I think, this year. All of them are freely available on our YouTube channel, and for the rest of the year, obviously, there'll be new episodes being released every month. But for now, thank you very much, Nate. Thank you everyone for watching, and see you all soon.